Hi guys, this is John Edward Willie, and once again, in following up this notion that I call a corpo real, which sounds odd, but really just means beginning with life as it is, in the sense in which at one time or another, everybody has to come home to earth. You know, the earth and the body are repeating metaphors in my own personal astrology. And again, I'm not metaphysical or astrological, but I think on a certain level, in a society where almost all of our language is being replaced with managerial technical terms, and we think about ourselves in managerial technical terms, we often attempt in a noble kind of way to find other ways of thinking that allow us to put together our lives in a way that doesn't really reduce it to the same kind of a grid. And so I say that as an unexpected apology for my own self-created mythology, which in many ways corpo realism is a reflection of. But I mean, it's no wonder that the corpo real is about precisely not that, which is the actuality of having a body not as an ideal thing, but as a funky, messy, difficult, painful, but also tragic, but also noble, also beautiful, also exquisite kind of thing, you know, the stuff of life, what life is. And so I begin with the question of wanting to address the facts of life. You know, if we're attempting to live sincerely and honestly, we want to look directly at our lives and ask ourselves what it is that we could or should be doing. And so it's not uncommon at all to have a to-do list, to keep a list of the things that you should be doing. And some of us have a longer list than others. And the underlying question really is how deep do you want to go with this list of things that you want to take care of in the name of having a body, in the name of living on earth? And I know this sounds abstruse, but what I'm trying to suggest is that there's a certain level at which we're wanting to do what is most immediate, what is most urgent, but there's an inherent, I hate to say, subjective quality to deciding, to selecting what counts as worth doing. And so I think that could be paralyzing on one level. It could be paralyzing in the sense in which you discover that you're sort of overwhelmed by the number of things that you can choose to do. You know, there's a sense in which there's an existential experience of, at the same time, discovering your own capacities and abilities, that you're sort of really shook by the obligation that you have to choose what you do with these gifts. And I think that in many ways cripples as many people as it does elevate them. So there's a certain difficulty, it's not subjective, but there's a difficulty ultimately in deciding what counts for you as a choice or what is worth choosing. And so I think that there's a sense in which it's not a choice, on the other hand, because so many people live in a state of emergency, including myself, where the things that we have to do are just given to us. We're thrown into these conditions. And so there's a difficulty in the sense in which we're not exactly doing what we want to do. This list is actually an attempt in many ways to create a set of practices. And so there's a sense in which what I want to offer is a kind of rubric, a kind of matrix within which a person might be able to take the immensity of choices that we have and actually be able to triangulate it into everyday life so that you can think clearly. And not only that, but live without thinking, because you can make these choices in terms of what you choose to do and what counts as a task or something that is to do, like taking out the trash or self-examination. You know, what is the task today? And so I think that there's a sort of liberating thing that is found when one is no longer living in fear and being pushed by the number of things that one is supposed to be doing, that one is not doing. Because I think that there's a fundamental sense in which there's a kind of flip where you can go from feeling the way that I have all of my life to feeling like, instead of being pushed by all these things that you're supposed to be doing, by this immensity of things that you're supposed to be doing. And you can go through what's sometimes called a paradigm shift, which is kind of a stupid way of thinking about what it means for a person to change their basic ideas in terms of what counts as life or what life is or who you are. And it sounds absurd at first, but when you go really deeply into these questions and this phenomena that doesn't seem to really have an obvious reason to go into, in other words, it's not really leading to anything immediate, you ultimately can walk away with surprises that you didn't expect. And one of those surprises might be the discovery that the very idea, not the idea that you had about having all these things that you had to do, but the very structure of that idea, the way that that idea takes shape in you, is something that in many ways is inherited. And so to live deliberately, to live intelligently, means to focus on the ways in which we actually have far more power than we realize we do. And I suggested that we can select what counts as something that we're supposed to do. But there's a sense in which the very meaning of what we do can be transformed by our underlying shift in consciousness in regards to what counts as significance. And so I am someone who has lived in their clouds their whole life. And so a part of what I do when I am thinking in corporal realism is bringing myself back down to having a body and living on the earth. And so there's a sense in which, like, as a sort of secular astrological model, this notion of earth and clouds allows one to imagine that one at one point or another has to come back home to earth. Like, we all have to come home to earth at some point or another. And that could mean a lot of things, not just getting lost in your thoughts, but even drug addictions, getting lost in like phantasmagorical pursuits. I mean, there's a sense in which it's beautiful and deeply human, but if you want to live, you ultimately do have to come back home to earth. And it may be that you are brought back home in a body bag. It might be that you're buried in the earth. That's what is meant by coming home to earth. And so if you're buried, you know, there's a sense in which you can save yourself by burying yourself before you die. And in fact, I think that on a certain level, that's what a lot of theology and a lot of what counts as like self-help is ultimately allowing people to do, which is to affirm a kind of paralysis that allows them to not have to think at all. So they die before they die. They live within the earth. And so it's not merely that in corporal realism, what one is wanting to do is to bring people down from the sky or from the cosmos and put them on the earth so they can be planted on the earth once again. But it's also to unbury the dead who are not dead, to bring back to life, to recover those in that which within oneself, which is buried alive. And so there's a sense in which what we call a task list is something that can mean a million different things. And yet it doesn't really help you if you're facing a situation where you have to seriously organize these tasks into a practical rubric or matrix, as I say. And so I think that the key way to think about it, as someone who has studied this as a way of wanting to be able to organize their own chaos, you know, to bring myself back down to earth, I've had to learn that I can't do everything. And so I tend to overestimate what I can do. But as it said, this is sort of a trope. I underestimate what I can do, which is I can focus every day on reading and writing and thinking and speaking, which I'm doing now. And so that mnemonic sort of way of thinking about it in a fourfold way allows me to keep track of what I'm doing. And I think that if I make videos about that later, it'll make much more sense. But what I'm also suggesting is that there are very simple ways that one can organize the overwhelming sense of what should I do or what can I do? Because I think that there's a sense in which a classically oriented person thinks about what life is and then works from those facts. And so there's a sense in which you have the day in front of you and you have certain options and opportunities, but you're also working within a certain kind of, I'm sorry guys, pardon me. You're working within a certain kind of difficulty that you have to really learn how to navigate on your own. And one way to think about that is that if you practice that sort of self-examination, if you live the self-examined life, the fruits of that is that you become really clear about what counts as your values and what counts ultimately as your desires. Because I'm sort of convinced that that's a part of what the self-examined life is that it allows you on a pluralistic level to discover not only your own voice in the sense that you discover who you are and who you cannot otherwise be, but you also discover your desires, and you discover the particularity of your selfhood. And what I mean by that is that if you're then thinking practically about creating a to-do list, you have it made, because most people really have no clue about what they're doing because they have no clue about what they are, and the sense in which they really don't know whether they value money or the life of the senses, which means on a certain level perhaps sacrificing only the pursuit of money, or they love their family enough to where they're not really willing to get too caught up in the kind of life that's required to ultimately enter the upper echelons of a company. I mean, those are minor examples, but what it allows you to do is to orient your task list on a day-to-day basis to where you can see things that you have to do because they are who you are. Like if you're a poet, you have to write poetry. And so you've really cleared a big path through doing that kind of deep work. And it seems absurd to other people, but living a self-examined life is one that allows you a practical liberation, which is that you can then use the rich discoveries about what you really think and about what you can think, and you're able to translate that into something, a praxis where you're not wasting your time. And so there's a sense in which if you get really clear about the kind of problems that you actually have, which is a whole other set of ideas and notions that I can explore in other videos, but it has to do with the fact that we're often told by others what counts as our problems. And so on a certain level, we have to decide what counts as a problem, whether it's intellectual or practical. You know, I think we're deeply confused about what counts as a problem. But again, if you're clear about it, and if you can connect it to an underlying feeling, it can actually turn your life into something that I was speaking about earlier as being a flip. And that flip is that you don't really feel the pain and frustration of being pushed around. You start feeling the joy of getting things done, of solving problems, of actually facing your situation, not in a way where you're making it about you or an identity or anything, but you're solving these problems as a way of activating your unconsciousness. You're living actively. And then there's a sense in which you're then pulled by possibilities, which is how I feel. Because honestly, on a certain level, I don't have anything to be excited about from other people's points of view. I've been told directly, and I've sort of discovered that there's a real power in taking control over how you interpret things. Because on a deeper level, what we are wanting to do here is to be able to free our minds. We want to free our minds. And my proposition in corporeal realism is that freedom is the most difficult thing. And in fact, that's why it is freedom, because it ultimately only appears to be paradoxical. I don't believe in paradoxicals, but it is ironic or paradoxical that one must sacrifice in order to get, that you have to give up something in order to get back. And so there's a certain level at which one is wanting to ask precisely what one is to give in order to receive. And what counts as giving and what counts as receiving is a very delicate kind of question regarding how we ground ourselves in our lives and how we ultimately decide what to do. And so, for instance, as I say, because I don't want to give the appearance that I've figured anything out, because I'm really at the start of certain struggles myself. And so even today, I've created a massive list of things that I have to do. And it's overwhelming because I can't organize them. But in another example of creative organizing, I created 8 different domains under which I could organize my problems that I face. And these are problems that I can't do all at once, but I can do them when I can. I can fit them like Tetris, like I can take these problems and fit them into the time that I have and the space that I have. And so I can organize my problems in terms of things I needed to do at home, things I needed to do with my health, with my finances, with my career. And it allows me to break all of these tasks into organizable bits and pieces that really gives me the kind of freedom that allows me to enjoy the rest of my day. And so that's something that if I talk about in the future, my own background, I might talk a little bit about like what it's like to live without ever having any sense of that peace or security. And so to learn these things like much later in life, I think there's a certain tragedy to it, but I don't see it that way. I think that it gives you a certain perspective on how valuable those underlying patterns and principles are. And so the patterns and principles of corporal realism are one thing that is crucial to having a way of living where you're living actively. And not only are you enjoying like being pulled by the discovery that you can take care of things, you're actually becoming like aggressive, like in a way that isn't aggressive to other people, but it's aggressive with yourself. Like you're living in like a hardcore way. Like others would be put off by that because we're often taught to be more gentle than we should be in regards to what we can do. And there's a philosopher named Michel Foucault who had discussed something called the cruelty of the self, to the self, the cruelty to the self, which in many ways is an intensification of what the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche had discovered to be the truth about the greatest joys and feelings in life. And so for Nietzsche and for Foucault, and I think on a certain level, Nietzsche had picked this up from Schelling, and it has to do with the fact that the greatest difficulties are precisely what allow for the greatest joys. And so on a certain level, in creating a task list where you're facing your most difficult problems, you're actually creating the opportunity for the greatest joys in your life. Like it's only by facing your greatest problems that you can even experience the greatest joys. And so that's precisely what makes me feel so absolutely alive, in that sense that one can have a kind of flip within themselves. And I think that flip is a sort of benefit of philosophical thinking that is highly overlooked, because that flip is what allows people ultimately to change. And human change is the greatest mystery in philosophy and psychology and economics, you know, the process by which a person lets go of or lets die the more ignorant, lifeless parts of themselves, the quicker they can live. And that's sort of like the greatest gift that you can give somebody. And so I will end this video now, or soon, because I have to remind myself that a person is not going to listen any more than a few seconds, let alone 7 minutes, let alone 17 minutes, especially when practical advice is not being given. And so I think that the thing that I want to leave you with is a question that I want to address in my next videos following up this subject, which is how far into yourself do you really want to go to face all the mistakes that you made in your life? Like how far into yourself do you want to go to really admit what you have done? And I don't mean that in a religious sense, but I mean the kind of intense self-examination that is not exactly like a day in the park, you know, because I myself like began that kind of turn like about 10 years ago. And what it meant was that I wasn't going to run away from my problems, and I wasn't going to seek ways out or solutions to the issues that I faced. I was going to practice what the philosopher Pascal had prescribed as being the most important but the most impossible thing, which is to simply sit in a room alone. And I think that on a certain level, that very act is what one is wanting to advocate, insofar as one can begin facing the real task of being human. You know, is it really to make money and succeed, or is there something like deeper in life that is pursued? And I'm not meaning to suggest that there's a deeper path, because I actually ironically believe that the depth is right in front of us. And I think on a certain level, the act of creating a task list is to clear everything that is getting in our way of being what we are, which is living, seeing life itself. I'm John Edward Willey, and I love you guys. Thank you for listening.